Hello. I'd like to talk to you today about Mary Braddon's novel Aurora Floyd. Aurora Floyd was published in 1862, originally as a serial publication in the Temple Bar magazine. It was published again a year later as a 3-volume novel, so in 1863 by William Tinsley Publishers. Aurora Floyd is really Mary Braddon's second most famous, most well-known novel. The most well-known novel is Lady Audley's Secret, and both were bestsellers. Mary Braddon was a best-selling writer during most of her writing career, but especially in the 1860s she was very famous for the sensation novel. Sensation novels were a genre that grew out of modern press coverage. There was so much more press coverage in the 19th century, mid-19th century. Paper was so much cheaper to produce, printing methods had become so much more efficient, that newspapers were very much more abundant and they needed to be filled. So one of the ways in which they were filled was with sensational trials about domestic violence, crimes of passion, and also the divorce courts could provide interesting ideas for plots for these sensation novels. After the Matrimonial Causes Act in 1857, there were many more divorce trials. That was the sort of immediate stimulus for the sensation novel. There were, of course, historical roots for the sensation or suspense novel lying in Gothic fiction. We can see in the suspense novels the typical polarisation of morals, polarisation of emotions that featured in the melodrama of the Gothic novel. A lot of melodrama in the Gothic novel as well, focusing or centering around women, women's powerlessness in society, and also entrapment. So usually in the Gothic novels, physical imprisonment. In the suspense novels, it's much more a case of psychological or societal imprisonment, that there is some element or aspect of social conventions of the time which are actually trapping the woman in a difficult situation from which she needs to escape one way or another. And this can often lead to desperation and potentially then into criminality on the part of the woman. The Newgate novels as well, sensational, often violent crime reporting, or drawn from the reporting of violent crimes in the newspapers again, so the Newgate novels were another source for the suspense novel. And really, I think the changing times of the period were one of the reasons for the interest in the suspense novel. Life was changing quite quickly. People had more affluence, people had more capacity and ability to move around. And all of this was creating considerable change, considerable social change in the Victorian era, as it does in every era, as it does in the current era as well. The sensation novels in some ways reflected concerns about rapid change in the structure of society, particularly in the position of women within society, but also in terms of social conventions changing, and whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. And judgment remains, I think, undecided on whether the sensation novels are supporting women's liberation or actually confirming that it's a lot safer for women to remain more behind the scenes in daily life. But that's quite a big debate. What we can say about sensation novels is that they often tend to, as well, contain certain features in common. There are certain typical features that pertain to the sensation novel. They tend to subvert character development and the depiction of realism or naturalism to the sequence of the plot. That's the most important element of the story, and characters will be constructed in order to facilitate the suspense and the pace of the plot. Typical features within this genre would be secrecy. We see that a lot in Aurora Floyd. Forebodings of events to come, visionary insights, dreams, pure and simple visions. These insights and visions are often set within the context of drama-infused weather, drama-infused buildings, drama-infused gardens, drama-infused wells, as in Lady Audley's Secret. But they also simply are there to heighten the plot. There's a lot of depiction of very, very hot summer in Yorkshire, in Aurora Floyd. Everything is absolutely intensely alive in the heat of the summer. The colours of the garden are really bright, really garish and stark. The vegetation is at its absolute height, its absolute zenith. It's as if everything is about to explode. There's so much energy, there's so much heat going on. And at the same time, the plot itself as well is building up to its absolute crescendo. Other features within the suspense novel would be mysterious unsolved clues about a secret or potentially a potential crime that's been committed. And these are unsolved clues are really littered about the plot, lots of different places. They keep cropping up, signalling to the reader that there's something to be discovered. Keep reading because there's something to be discovered. Often there'll be these very fast-paced comings and goings in the novels. Railway travel meant that people were able to come and go, to shoot about the country in unpredictable ways, to appear to be in one place whilst actually having secretly travelled at speed to another place and then come back without anybody knowing. In theory, it was possible for people to do things, to commit crimes, because of this ability to move around so fast. There will be usually quite a number of coincidences in suspense novels, and some of these will involve pretty impossible sequences to achieve in real life. We see this in Aurora Floyd later on in the novel, but we do see it. It's not so prevalent in Aurora Floyd. It's a lot more prevalent in Lady Audley's Secret, a lot more prevalent in, for example, Wilkie Collins's Woman in White, and also his No Name, a great deal more prominent. And I think also Man and Wife. There's a lot of coincident sequences in those novels. Disappearance, the disappearance of a person, of an individual, the suspicion that they're dead. They may be dead, they may not be dead, or it may be that someone appears to be dead in order to continue some kind of an activity without people knowing about it, or it's believed that someone is dead and that then they actually after all are not dead, which is one way in which the bigamy novel crops up. And bigamy is another typical feature of the suspense novel. Blackmail occurs as well as another feature within the whole area of secrecy. Altogether, the general impression that the sensation novel creates is one of melodrama. This novel, Aurora Floyd, seeks to create suspense and drama in the opening chapters in a rather different way, though not so much associated with melodrama. We enter a rarefied world of great beauty and settled privilege in the first pages of the novel. There are minute descriptions of the country home, of the Floyd family, of the garden, detailed descriptions of how it appears in the natural setting, of its location, of the plants growing, and indeed of the weather prevailing at the time. Beautiful, beautiful late Indian summer sunshine. An effete aura is built up around the Floyd family, and it's almost as if misfortune would be a sort of transgression against the moral order of the universe, of society. They are privileged, and they are highly entitled to their privilege, is the position of the novel. And we learn that the Floyd family are, of course, a self-made family. They haven't gained or acquired. Archibald Floyd doesn't live in his country house and have his country estate because he has inherited this wealth. This is self-made wealth. This is wealth that the Floyd family has generated for itself within very recent times. They are an extremely successful family. Despite the fact that they have risen in the world through commercial activity, they nonetheless are leading, highly convincingly, the life of the traditional country gentry. They are in that sort of traditional sense lords of the manor. As Aurora Floyd grows older and is able to take on a level of independent action, she goes out into the local village and out towards the local tenantry and distributes charity. It's the typical action of the country gentry, the people that essentially were in authority in country areas and had been for generations. I think that this is an important point. The novel really is asserting the right of the middle classes to rise through their own endeavours and to be accepted as much as any other family who is affluent and living a wealthy life. That birth or history, family history, is not the important factor. It's how you live that's the important factor. And I think that the Floyd family would have been very attractive to Mary Braddon's readership. She would have had a very middle class readership, and wherever the individual reading the novel was on the scale of rising social mobility, rising bourgeois affluence, bourgeois acquisition, they would have had sympathy for the hard-working Floyd family who had made it to a very successful position, a fairly unassailable position financially for the period. The middle classes in the Victorian era were a lot of the time afraid of their wealth suddenly disappearing. Private banks collapsed, people's fortunes were made and lost as a result of bank collapsing. There was a lot of speculation at sea. Insurance policies were probably not as well developed as they are today, and people did simply, from overnight, would lose their wealth and their middle class status and position in society. And because there was no provision for people very much at this time, socially, if they didn't have any money, that was a very devastating fate if it happened. So the Floyd family are set in this wonderfully beautiful home, this incredible, limpid description of their abode is set in what is emphasised is the stillness of the weather. It's beautiful weather, poised in autumn stillness, prolonged summer. The inevitability is that the weather will break, that the winter storms will come upon the family. And so on the one hand we're given this picture of tranquility, establishment, unassailability, and yet at another level we're waiting all the time because of the context of the weather, the setting in the autumn, for the storm to break and everything to come crashing down. Although the family is clearly, in the novel, is clearly considered by the author to be highly worthy and appropriately set in its superior position in society, there is nonetheless a level of hostility coming in towards the Floyd family from local families, a level of enmity and jealousy, really. This, to some extent, comes about because Archibald Floyd, the self-made man, has made the social mistake of marrying a woman who is of a lower social class. Archibald Floyd, on a business trip to the north of the country, has met an actress. He's gone to a play and met the actress Eliza Percival in a small town provincial repertory theatre company production. Eliza is the daughter of a captain in the Merchant Navy who lived in Liverpool. We don't know anything about her mother, who died when she was very young. She was essentially brought up by her aunt. There's a possible implication that her mother might have been foreign because Eliza is so incredibly dark eyes, dark hair. So there's this idea that perhaps she is foreign, which will, in the context of the period, tend towards the idea that she can't be quite as morally aligned with the robust standards and conventions of British society as she might be. At all events, she's a struggling actress, a jobbing actress, moving from place to place with this small repertory company, just about surviving financially. She's been doing this for years. She's now in her late 20s. The novel makes it clear, and this is important, that she has preserved her virtue throughout those years of struggle. Archibald Floyd falls madly in love with her, wishes to marry her. Eliza Percival is prepared to accept his love, which of course is different perhaps from that she falls in love with him. She accepts his love, they get married. She hasn't realised how incredibly wealthy he is. And she's suddenly removed then to a new world. She becomes the mistress of a large country house, country estate. She takes up gardening. It's a seamless transition. It's an unrealistic transition, of course, to imagine that a young woman from that socio-economic background could make the transition to managing a house, of managing a large body of servants, and to just really be able to step into the new life. But this is how the fairy tale is told. This is the story. It's useful as well to observe the way in which this story is depicted. It's a very simplistic, it's very straightforward. This happened, that happened, therefore this happened. There's no analysis of the psychological processes that either Archibald or Eliza have gone through during the course of their courtship. There's no deeper analysis of what Archibald might have thought about how his wife would be able to fit in. There's no discussion about this. There's very little naturalism or realism that happens here. If we think perhaps about the beginning of George Eliot's Middlemarch and how Dorothea ponders her future marriage, how she'll bring it about, who would make a good partner, and then Celia's view of Dorothea's ideas about getting married and how to find a good partner. There's so much more realism, there's so much more naturalism in it. Mary Braddon was writing a different kind of story. She is telling a fairy tale. This is the Cinderella fairy tale. And that's what she wants to tell. She wants it to be very straightforward. The plot is the important point. The fairy tale, though, is overturned, quite dramatically overturned. There's no happily ever after. They get married, but it's not happily ever after, because quite soon after the marriage, soon after the birth of her daughter Aurora, Eliza dies. And this then is highly influential for the repercussions of the rest of the plot. Archibald Floyd withdraws from society, brings up his daughter on his own, with governesses, but largely on his own and in seclusion. And Aurora has to somehow make up for the shortfall in her life of not having a mother. And this is a very important aspect and facet of why she is forgiven for many of the things that she does, which normally speaking in Victorian society would not have been really forgivable. They would have led ultimately to ostracization from polite society or from society at all at that period. So suspense then is created in these three different ways. The drama-infused weather of the autumn that never ends, the hostility of the society surrounding the enclave of Feldon Woods, the country estate of the Floyd family. There are ominous hints about what this hostility might lead to. In fact, these are never fulfilled within the plot. It's just a way of creating a sense of ominousness around the Floyd family's future. There is as well, to some extent, the flashback to the past, which creates delays in action in the present, the flashback to the past of the romance. Grief comes into the Floyd world, this perfect family set in this wonderful environment actually has suffered great tragedy. So again, we're wondering what else can befall the family, given that they've already suffered a level of disaster. The daughter of this union with an outsider, a woman who is or was an outsider, also causes a level of disquiet for the reader in the way in which she's described. Aurora is described as very, very dark in her colouring. There's considerable emphasis on her black eyes, her blue-black hair. And this darkness has two significances. One is that of the foreigner, the outsider, the one who does not belong and who does not understand the codes of society, the society in which they find themselves. But also because the eyes are the mirror of the soul, the darkness of the eyes suggests that the mind may also be dark, and if the mind is dark, it may also veer towards duplicity, deception, not to say, at the extreme of those features, criminality. The factor of the stranger is an important one to think about. The people, the society around Feldon Woods clearly exhibits a level of xenophobia towards Eliza Percival, stroke Floyd. She comes from a completely different social world, completely different social context and milieu. So lower financially, lower socially, and also she belongs to the theatre world, the world of performance, the world in which people pretend to be something that they're not. They put on an act. It's their job. But they are in the line of deception. they're in the line of false representation, even though that's their work. The phrase spangles and stardust occurs frequently throughout the novel to suggest that because Eliza comes from a different world, she is never going to be able to drop the standards of behaviour that pertain to that world, which is regarded as lesser and lower. And the implication is as well that her daughter, as a matter of course, will inherit these tendencies towards spangles and stardust, towards an inability to understand what true values are, what solid values in society are. And it's of course an irrational viewpoint. Aurora will be brought up in a different context, she will have very different experiences, her mother isn't even actually present, her whole education will be entirely different. But this idea that in particular a girl inherited the moral tendencies of her mother was very strong at the period, and it's shown here in terms that she will inherit the really social class tendencies of her mother, that she won't be able to adapt to being a member of the governing class, because it's not in her genetics. And then finally we have the mysterious quarrel between the father and the daughter, this unsolved issue between the normally devoted parent and the normally beloved daughter. We don't learn what the quarrel is about. There are hints in the plot, the story leading up to the quarrel. The hints are there. When everything is unravelled at the end of the novel, we can go back and retrace them. But at the time, the reader is given no clear indication of what has happened, although question marks might be raised in the reader's mind here and there about certain things in those early chapters surrounding Aurora's education. She's given a lot of freedom, too much freedom clearly. She's allowed to go out riding for long periods of time with a servant, but it's a male servant, and that's really quite questionable. Her father makes a selection of his servant in a way that is doubtful, but we'll discuss that later. We'll discuss that later when we're further on, so as not to give the plot away too much in advance. So there's this unexplained family quarrel, and the daughter is banished. And so in this point, and in this feature of the story, then we're on the solid ground, I think, of the suspense novel and the typical features of the suspense novel.